In a quiet mountain resort town in North California, a small cabin became the scene of one of the most brutal and baffling unsolved crimes in American history. 3 people were killed, 1 child vanished into the night, and the survivors were left with memories they've never been able to outrun. Over 40 years later, the case is still plagued by missing evidence, conflicting witness accounts, and whispers of a cover-up that reaches far beyond the Keddie woods. This isn't just a mystery. This is a story about fear, silence, and secrets buried deep in a rural community, some of which may never be unearthed. I'm Fiona, and this is Case Continued. In the spring of 1981, the small mountain community of Keddie, California, was the kind of place where people left their doors unlocked and children roamed freely. But on the morning of April the 12th, that sense of safety was shattered forever. Inside cabin 28 of the Keddie resort, a crime had taken place that would leave lasting scars on the town and decades of unanswered questions. The victims were 36-year-old Glenna Susan Sue Sharp, her 15-year-old son, John, and John's best friend, 17-year-old Dana Wingate. Sue's 14-year-old daughter, Sheila, had spent the night at a friend's house. When she returned home the next morning, she walked straight into a scene that would change her life forever. Sue's 2 younger sons, Rick and Greg, along with their friend, Justin Smart, had been in cabin 28 overnight, but were physically unharmed. Missing from the home was Sue's 12-year-old daughter, Tina. For 3 long years, Tina remained a missing person. Then, in April 1984, a bottle collector made a grim discovery in Butte County. Her skull and several other bones found near a remote site known as Camp 18, more than 60 miles away from Keddie. Despite an investigation that spanned decades and examined multiple leads, no charges were ever brought. In recent years, new developments, including the recovery of a hammer from a nearby pond in 2016 and the testing of fresh DNA evidence, have reignited hope that this mystery might finally be solved. Yet, more than 4 decades on, the Keddie murders remain one of California's most disturbing unsolved cases, shadowed by rumours, contradictions, and the lingering fear that someone has always known more than they've admitted. Sue Sharp, born Glenna Susan Davis on March the 29th, 1945, in Springfield, Massachusetts, married James Sharp in 1965, and together they had 5 children: John, Sheila, Tina, Rick, and Greg. Her husband, a Vietnam War veteran, struggled with alcoholism, and the marriage was marred by increasing abuse. In July 1979, Sue made a courageous decision to leave him, escaping an environment that was no longer safe for her or the children. Sue relocated with her 5 children from Connecticut to Northern California to be near her brother, Don. Initially, they lived in a cramped trailer in Claremont Trailer Village, Quincy, one that Don had previously occupied with his wife and recently moved out of. By the autumn of 1980, Sue found a more spacious but still modest home in cabin 28 at Keddie Resort, a former recreation area turned low-income rental opportunity. The cabin had become available after the local sheriff moved out, giving Sue and her children a bigger place in a quiet, wooded area. To support her family, Sue worked odd part-time jobs, such as at the Quincy Elks Lodge, and she enrolled in federal training programs under the California Education and Training Act, attending typing and business classes at Feather River College. Sue was generally private and reserved, somewhat of a loner by all accounts. Some neighbours described her as hard-working, kind and devoted to her children. She earned a reputation as a good student, and she was admired for her determination to forge a better life. Other neighbours weren't as convinced. Her next-door neighbours, the Seabolts, refused to let their children go to Cabin 28 due to Sue's parenting skills. According to Sue's daughter, Sheila, Sue was frequently subjected to rumours, some alleging neglect, drug use and prostitution. But when interviewed, Sheila insisted she was a kind and loving mother who was doing her very best to raise 5 children alone. My mother's kindness and grace also extended beyond her own family, which may have ultimately been her downfall. While the move to Keddie didn't guarantee comfort, Sue reportedly worked tirelessly to provide for her family, often going without so the children could have what they needed. She held on to hope for a brighter future and valued education and opportunity above all. John Stephen Sharp was born on November the 16th, 1965, the eldest son of Sue and James. As a teenager, John was navigating the challenges of growing up in a fractured family and a small community. Those who knew him described him as a typical teen, sometimes quiet and withdrawn, other times friendly and outgoing. It's reported he was close to his family, but also sought independence, as many teens do. John had a close friendship with Dana Wingate, a peer who often spent time at the Sharp family home. Their bond was significant. The two were often inseparable. It's been said that John was also quite protective of his younger siblings and sometimes played a role in looking after them. Though details about John's school life are limited, it is known that he was attending school in the area and had a circle of friends, including Dana. Neighbours recall the Sharp household as quite busy at times, with children coming and going, and John often involved in typical teenage activities. The family environment was complicated though, and various rumours about John's drug use circulated over the years. It appears that John's best friend, Dana, who was 2 years his senior, may not have been the best influence. Dana Hall Wingate, born on the 8th of February 1964, had been placed on probation sometime in 1980 for slashing $7,000 worth of tyres at Nugget Motors. Dana had a troubled home life and was already in foster care in 1980, not due to any kind of familial abuse or neglect, but because of his behavioural and antisocial problems. Reports state that he had been known to commit crimes such as burglary, taking and potentially dealing drugs, and some sources say he also had a taste for cruelty to animals. Sheila Sharp was born in 1966, the eldest daughter of Sue and James. As the oldest of 3 siblings, Sheila carried a significant responsibility within the family. She was often described as mature and protective, someone who helped her mother care for her younger brothers and sister during difficult times. Sheila was known to be quiet, thoughtful, and sensitive. Despite the hardships at home, including witnessing the struggles between her parents and the challenges of their unstable living conditions, she maintained a close bond with her family. Neighbours and friends recall Sheila as a caring and devoted daughter who tried to keep peace within a sometimes turbulent household. Sheila's relationship with her mother was complex, but loving. While Sue worked tirelessly to provide for and protect her children, Sheila sometimes felt the weight of the family struggles deeply. She was protective of her siblings, especially the younger ones, and in many ways, she acted as a secondary caregiver during times when Sue was working or attending college. Sheila had also suffered a huge loss and experienced a tragic ordeal. At just 14 years of age, she had given birth to a baby and had her put up for adoption in Oregon. It's unknown who exactly the baby's father was, and we do have to respect the privacy of that situation for all involved, especially given the time when this happened. But there are a lot of reports that Sheila had been dating a boy named Richard Meeks, whom she'd met when the family moved to Quincy. It's often theorised that Richard was the baby's dad. Richard was the son of Nina Meeks, Sue's only real true friend in the area. Tina Louise Sharp was born on July the 22nd, 1968. She was 12 years old at the time of the murders. Described by family and friends as quiet and somewhat shy, Tina was known to have learning difficulties and was reportedly in special education classes at school. Despite these challenges, those close to her remember her as sweet and gentle. Tina's life was complicated by the strained and difficult home environment. On the 1st of July 1980, Tina and a school friend were enticed by a male adult neighbour offering them ice cream. The man, Daniel French, molested both the girls. According to surviving records, no criminal action was taken against Daniel French at that time, and the investigators somehow managed to blame the victims for the case going nowhere. Despite all this, a lot of sources still report that Tina was a very happy child. Rick and Greg, aged 10 and 5 respectively, were the two youngest children in the Sharp family. There aren't many details about them in regard to their personalities or hobbies. They were probably just like other young boys of their ages, likely lost in a world of sibling games and outdoor adventures. There don't appear to be any documents relating to the abuse that Sue's children suffered at the hands of their father, James, but Sheila stated some years later that James had abused both her and Tina. It's really unclear what had actually been happening in this family prior to the move to Keddie, but none of it sounds good. When Sue Sharp and her 5 children reached Northern California in 1979, they weren't met with comfort, they were met with survival. The first real foothold wasn't in a cabin or a house, but a single trailer at Claremont Trailer Village in Quincy, slot number 27A to be exact. This wasn't the luxury of a warm welcome. It was cramped and makeshift. No space, 5 children and one exhausted mother, all trying to regroup under one narrow roof. Yet it was enough to just catch a breath, collect their nerves and start reconstructing a life. Sue met a man named Randall at Claremont and they went on 2 dates, but for reasons unknown, the pair decided not to pursue a relationship and went their separate ways. This trailer park, unassuming, unglamorous, was where the Sharps began their next chapter. It wasn't home, but it was something better than nowhere. And then an opportunity presented itself. A cabin in a rural area with a stream for the children to play by. Quiet, lots of outdoor space. Sue jumped at the chance and once again she packed up her 5 children and made the move. If you were to wind your way through the mountains of Northern California in the late 1970s, you might eventually stumble upon Keddie, a small, unassuming resort tucked deep into the Sierra Nevadas. Back then, it was the kind of place that never made the headlines. It was quiet, self-contained, and for some, it was the perfect escape from the noise of bigger towns, or problems they wanted to leave behind. Keddie wasn't just a scattering of houses, it was a former holiday resort. In its prime, it had been a popular getaway, drawing visitors to its lodge, the old dining hall, and a collection of around 33 cabins. By the early 80s, though, the tourist boom had fizzled out. Many of the cabins had been converted into long-term rentals, offering low-cost housing to families who didn't mind the isolation. That's what made Keddie unique. It was both a neighbourhood and a relic of the past. The people here knew one another, not just by name, but by routine. Kids roamed the dirt roads and forest trails freely, crossing from one cabin to another without a second thought. Parents looked out for each other's children. If someone's truck broke down, there'd be a neighbour with jumper cables before you even had to ask. Life here wasn't glamorous. The winters were harsh. Jobs were scarce and money was tight for most, but there was a certain resilience among the residents, a sense that they were all making the best of a tucked-away life in the pines. By 1981, there were around 60 people living in Keddie, a small number even by rural standards. The nearest town with schools and shops was Quincy, just a few miles down the road. Keddie itself didn't have much in the way of industry anymore. What it did have was a community bound together by shared space, shared struggles, and, for better or worse, shared secrets. That's the backdrop against which the Sharps had made their final home in Cabin 28. What they didn't know was that within just a few short months of moving in, Keddie would become known across America for something no one in that quiet little valley could have ever imagined. Cabin 28 had 2 bedrooms, but 15-year-old John Sharp didn't sleep upstairs with the rest of the family. Instead, he stayed in a basement room that could only be reached from outside. The doors to the cabin were usually left unlocked so John could easily get upstairs, especially to use the only bathroom. Meanwhile, the 2 younger boys, Rick and Greg, shared one bedroom, and Sue slept with her daughters, Sheila and Tina, in the other. She also sometimes slept on the pull-out bed in the living room. I have drawn a little map of the cabin here so you get an idea of the interior layout. I am definitely no Picasso, but hopefully it just lets you see the space that we're working with. According to reports, neither Sue nor her children got any support from James Sharp, and Sue hadn't even given James her new address or phone number because she didn't want him to know where her and the children lived. To make ends meet, she relied on a modest $250 Navy income, food stamps, part-time work, and the small stipend she received for going to her typing classes at Feather River College. In the same class were Marilyn and Marty Smart, who had been together since around 1979. The Smarts arrived in Keddie sometime in 1980 with Marilyn's son, Justin Eason, and Martin went to work as a cook in the on-site restaurant. That's when they moved into Cabin 26, across a narrow street called Spanish Oaks Lane, opposite the Sharps' home. Right next door to the Sharp family was Cabin 27, occupied by the Seabolt family, James Sr., his wife Sanita, daughters Alyssa and Paula, and son James, Jamie Jr. The Sharp family frequently played with the Seabolt kids, Marilyn Smart's son Justin, and others around the area. Dana Wingate, John's friend, had actually been dating Alyssa Seabolt for a week before the murders. The cabin cluster was tight-knit. Kids rode bikes between cabins and played together every day, typical of a small community environment. The morning of April 11th, 1981, began quietly in Keddie. In Cabin 28, Sue's oldest son, John, had been sleeping in the basement, while her daughters, Sheila and Tina, shared a bedroom with her, and her younger boys, Ricky and Greg, shared their bedroom off of the living room. Sue made breakfast for the kids, who were restless and eager to spend the day outside and seeing their friends. At 9:30 a.m, Sue, Sheila, Ricky, Greg, and Justin Eason drove to Quincy. Sue dropped Ricky and Justin off at ball practice at a field adjacent to Gansner Park and then drove to see her friend, Nina Meeks. Sheila walked from there to a friend's house nearby. At 10:15 a.m, Sue telephoned Sheila at the friend's house. Sue, Sheila and Greg then drove toward home. They picked up Johnny and his friend Dana, who had been hitchhiking near Gansner Park. Hitchhiking was something the pair frequently did between Keddie and Quincy to visit friends and go to parties. Sue, Sheila, Greg, John and Dana arrived home in Keddie at around 1:30 p.m. Tina had stayed at home all morning and was there when the family returned. Justin, who had arrived home separately, went over to the Sharp house, and he and Ricky rode bikes and played with friends until about 6 p.m. that evening. John changed his clothes and put on a purple jogging suit with white stripes and a headband. Dana was reportedly wearing exactly the same thing. Both of them then hitchhiked back to Quincy at around 3:30 p.m. to attend a party. Sue went inside to watch TV, Sheila stayed outside talking to Alyssa Seabolt, and Tina went to spend time in the Seabolt cabin. As daylight faded, Rick, Greg and Justin were inside Cabin 28, settling in for the night. Sue was also still home and both girls were at the Seabolt residence. Sue, Ricky, Greg and Justin had burritos for dinner. Ricky, Greg and Justin ate in the kitchen and Sue ate on the couch in the living room in front of the TV. Sheila had gone to the Seabolt residence to spend the night. Tina often slept over in the Seabolt's cabin, but on this occasion it was decided that Sheila should be able to spend an overnight with her friend, Elisa. Tina had asked if she could sleep over too, but was told no and was asked to go back to her own home before bedtime. Between 6:30 and 6:45 p.m, John and Dana arrived at a friend's apartment in East Quincy to get a ride back to Keddie. The friend would later report that John had a week-old black eye and was wearing a red bandana and Dana's blue vest. Dana, a diabetic, gave himself an insulin shot while he was there, and it was reported that neither of the boys seemed intoxicated at this point in time. At around 7:30 p.m, Tina returned to her cabin from the Seabolts next door, washed the dishes for her mum, and returned to her friends for a while. Sheila returned home to cabin 28 to get her night clothes at about the same time. She later said that Sue mentioned that the boys, John and Dana, had gone back to town, and she said that Sue was lying on the couch. The Barbara Mandrell show was on, and Rick, Greg and Justin were there all watching the TV together. Sheila returned next door to the Seabolts 10 to 15 minutes later, and this was a decision that would ultimately save her life. At 8:30 p.m, Greg went to bed. He took the spare single bed in the room that he shared with Rick, leaving the 2 bunk beds free for Rick and Justin. At 9 p.m, Sue got changed into her nightwear and dressing gown. Love Boat was on the TV, and she started watching it with Ricky and Justin. Between 9:30 and 9:45 p.m, Tina returned to the cabin from the Seabolts. She briefly spoke to her family and then went straight to bed in the room she shared with her sister and mother. Tina was wearing a blue t-shirt, blue jeans and white tennis shoes. Ricky and Justin went to bed at 10 p.m. when Love Boat finished. They talked for 10 minutes and Ricky went to sleep. Justin stated that he went to bed in the bottom bunk in the boys' room. The exact movements of the family in those last hours remain unclear. There were many differing reports of John and Dana's whereabouts from witnesses, and Justin himself reports he heard them enter the Sharp cabin at midnight. We don't know if Sue was in bed in the bedroom with Tina, or if she was asleep or still watching TV on the pull-out couch in the living room. What we do know is that sometime between 10 p.m. and the early hours of the morning, John and Dana returned home. This is believed to be the moment when all 6 people who would become central to the case, Sue, her 3 children, John, Ricky and Tina, plus Dana and Justin, were inside the cabin. What happened next remains one of California's most disturbing and intriguing mysteries. At some point during the early hours of April the 12th, unknown intruders entered cabin 28. At 8 a.m, Sheila Sharp left the Seabolt residence for home. She was planning to attend a church service with the Seabolts and she wanted to get a suitable change of clothes. Shortly after returning home, she ran back next door, hysterical, shouting for help. She was screaming that there was blood all over, a knife, and the hands of 3 bodies were tied. James Seabolt ran next door to cabin 28 and found the back door unlocked. After witnessing the murder scene, he sprinted over to the lodge at Keddie Resort, as the Seabolts didn't have a telephone in their home, and co-owner Jan Albin placed a call to police, alerting them to the murders. James Seabolt Jr. and Sheila ran back to cabin 28 while the police were being informed of the scene. A look through the boys' bedroom window showed, miraculously, Greg, Ricky and Justin all in bed, seemingly sleeping. Sheila and James Jr. opened Ricky and Greg's bedroom window and woke the 3 boys up, telling them to get out through the window so that they'd avoid seeing the gruesome crime scene in the room next door. Surprisingly, they seemed to have slept through the massacre. The mystery was really just beginning. Deputy Hank Clement was the first officer on the scene. Just inside the doorway, lying on his back with his feet almost touching the south wall, was John Sharp. Beside him, only a few inches away, lay a cheap table steak knife, the same one Sheila had noticed earlier. 2 feet beyond John, and lying parallel to him, was his friend, Dana Wingate. Dana was face down, his head resting awkwardly on the corner of a couch cushion that had been pulled from its place. Closest to the couch was Sue Sharp, lying on her right side, her head near the base of the sofa, and her feet almost brushing against Dana's arm. She was naked from the waist down and was the only one partially concealed, covered with a blanket, later traced back to Tina's bed. John lay with his hands resting against his abdomen, bound tightly at the wrists with several precise loops of white medical tape. His ankles were secured with a white extension cord, twice wrapped and the knots pulled tight. That cord ran in a straight, deliberate line toward the base of the overturned TV stand, then made a sharp 90-degree turn, leading directly to Dana's feet. The autopsy revealed horrific injuries. His throat was brutally slashed, severing major blood vessels and damaging his voice box, cutting off any chance of survival. His skull was shattered in multiple places, with deep bruises and swelling inside his brain from the violent blows. He had multiple deep stab wounds to his chest, adding to the savage attack. The bone around his right eye was broken, evidence of severe trauma to his face. His cause of death was clear: the fatal slash to his throat, combined with the devastating head injuries. Dana's ankles were bound only loosely with the same cord, but the scene told its own story. One of his hiking boots bore a single loop of medical tape, while his other had only half a loop, torn as though ripped in a desperate struggle. The tape on his wrists was also broken, the frayed ends still clinging stubbornly to his right wrist. And unlike John, Dana's bindings were wider and stronger, almost as if whoever tied them knew they'd need more to restrain him. Dana's autopsy revealed severe and devastating injuries. He had multiple fractures to the skull and facial bones, along with cuts and bruising on the brain, which had begun to swell from the trauma. There was bleeding deep in the soft tissues of the neck, along with tiny broken blood vessels and swelling in the face, signs that strangulation had taken place. Bleeding was also found around the brain's protective layers. Several teeth were broken and loose, likely from blunt force, and there was some blood in the airway, indicating that Dana had breathed in his own blood. The cause of death was listed as a combination of severe head trauma and manual strangulation. Sue's restraints were by far the most elaborate and chillingly deliberate. Her wrists and ankles were first wrapped in narrow medical tape, loose enough to suggest carelessness, but laid over that was a tight loop of electrical cord, knotted again and again as if crafted to guarantee she wouldn't escape. Over that, a heavier cord was wound, its knot securing a third length that stretched down to her ankles, pulling them tightly together. And just when it seemed there couldn't be more, yet another wire sealed her ankles in a final, needless bind, an almost spiteful act of control. The cord connecting her wrists and ankles was pulled so tight that her knees were forced together. Her mouth was gagged with a bandana, and her own underwear shoved to the back of her throat and held in place by strips of medical tape pressed firmly across her lips. Sue had several deep stab wounds to her chest. Her throat had been slashed, and a yellow blanket had been placed on her to cover the body. It appeared she had died from blunt force trauma after she was beaten on the outside of the head with the butt of a rifle, which had been so vicious it left an imprint. The weapon itself was taken away by the perpetrators, but investigators later identified it as a Daisy Powerline 880 BB gun. They found broken pieces of the barrel sight and a fired pellet left behind at the crime scene, confirming its use. The autopsy showed just how brutal the attack on Sue Sharp was. She had multiple stab wounds to her chest, deep enough to damage major parts, like her heart's main artery, the sac around her heart, and one of her lungs. This caused a massive internal bleed that filled her chest with blood. She also had a horizontal stab wound to her throat, which made blood get into her airway, making it impossible to breathe. Her head and face were badly cut, with broken bones in her skull and a shattered eye socket. Inside her head, there was bleeding around the brain and a bruise on the brain itself from the trauma. Several of her teeth were broken and loose, likely from heavy blows, and her arms and the back of her left hand showed many cuts and defensive wounds, signs she tried desperately to fight back. The murders had unfolded in the living room, a scene soaked in utter violence. Blood splattered wildly across the floors, walls, bedroom doors, and even the ceiling, painting a grim picture of a killer lost in a savage frenzy. The bottoms of Sue's bare feet and the soles of one of the boys' shoes were stained with blood, revealing that they'd moved around during the attack, stepping through the spreading horror. Blood was also found outside the cabin, smeared on the handrail of the steps. When Plumas County Patrol Commander Rod DeCroner arrived, the horror of the scene was undeniable. He would later recall, "They stabbed and pounded on everything in visible sight. The walls, the people, the furniture, everything. There was blood sprayed absolutely everywhere. You knew right away we were involved with a psychopath." A bloodied hammer and 2 knives lay abandoned at the scene, silent witnesses to a savage attack. Inside the cabin, the lights were switched off, the heavy curtains were drawn tight, and the telephone had been deliberately left off the receiver. During the initial search, 12-year-old Tina Sharp was nowhere to be found. Police believed she hadn't been present during the murders, and so she was a largely ignored entity until they questioned Sheila later in the day, and the full picture began to emerge. Tina had returned home before bed, but was now missing from the crime scene. Sheila revealed that Tina's jacket and shoes were gone, and disturbingly, that it was her yellow blanket that had been used to cover her mother's body. Sheila also noted that a topped-up toolbox had also been taken from the house. This was a toolbox that Tina was allegedly quite fond of and liked organising the tools inside. Over half a day had passed, and only then was Tina properly acknowledged. Blood was found on Tina's bed. Knife marks were found on multiple walls around the home. A bloody fingerprint was found inside a door frame and on a railing. A footprint was found at the back of the house. There had been no signs of forced entry, and Jamie Seabolt's remark about the back door being left open was also taken into account. The police strongly suspected at least 2 killers were there to have control over the family, and that they were in no rush. Detectives made note of a severe lack of fingerprints left at the scene, which led investigators to believe that the killers were prepared and had planned the massacre in advance. Because forensic evidence wasn't commonly collected until the mid-1980s, any hair, skin cells and other DNA transfers were not taken from the crime scene. Investigators began questioning neighbours and potential witnesses about that night. Sheila and the Seabolt family, who lived right next door, insisted they heard nothing unusual at all the entire night. No sounds of a struggle, no signs of chaos. But not everyone shared that silence. A couple in cabin number 16 reported being jolted awake at 1:15 a.m. by what they described as muffled screaming. They didn't know where it was coming from though, so apparently just went back to sleep. Other neighbours recalled a dog barking near cabin 28 and a porch light flickering on around 4 a.m. Someone else mentioned their cats behaving strangely, restless and pacing in and out of the house instead of curling up to sleep as they usually did. Multiple residents, including the Seabolts, remembered seeing an unfamiliar green van parked outside the Sharps' home at around 9 p.m. that evening, and also a brown Datsun with a flat or flattening tyre in the area that had vanished by the morning. The occupants of cabin 26, the Smart family, were also questioned. Marilyn Smart told investigators she had been asleep during the time of the murders. That night, Marty Smart had been at home, but not for long. He left to go drinking at a local bar with a friend, returning only in the early morning hours. That friend, who had been staying with the Smarts on a temporary basis, was a man named Severin John Bo Boobaday. Marty wasn't working that evening. Normally a chef at the backdoor bar, this was his night off. A veteran of the Vietnam War, He carried the scars of PTSD. He'd been receiving treatment at a VA hospital, a medical facility for US military veterans, where he met Bo just weeks before the murders. Their friendship was new, yet somehow close enough for Marty to invite Bo into his home to share the cramped space of cabin 26. Neighbours didn't know much about Bo, where he came from, or why he was there. But in the days to come, his presence in Keddie would become one of the most unsettling threads in this case. On April 13th, 1981, Marty Smart sat down for questioning and began to weave his account of the night of April the 11th. He said that he, Bo Boobaday, and his wife, Marilyn, decided to head out for drinks at the backdoor bar. Before leaving, Marty claimed he stopped by cabin 28, asking Sue Sharp if she wanted to join them. It seemed that Marty had wanted to set Sue up with Bo, and Bo was quite keen on Sue, but she had refused the invitation. At the bar, Marty ordered drinks, but immediately began complaining to the bartender about the music. Later, the trio returned to their cabin. Marilyn, he said, watched TV before heading off to bed, while Marty, still irritated about the music, called the bar to complain again. Not long after, he and Bo decided to go back there for more drinks. By then, the Plumas County Sheriff's Office believed they had a potential suspect in Marty Smart and reached out for help from the Department of Justice in Sacramento. Investigators Harry Bradley and PA Krim were dispatched to dig deeper. The two Department of Justice agents sent to assist weren't homicide detectives at all. They were special agents from the Organised Crime Unit, which typically handled cases involving drug trafficking, prostitution rings, biker gangs, and mob-related activity. That's really unusual for two reasons. Firstly, the Keddie murders weren't, at least on the surface, tied to organised crime. There'd been no public suggestion of mob involvement, drug deals, or gang violence in Cabin 28. And secondly, it bypassed the normal homicide procedure. In a triple murder, especially one involving children, you'd normally expect a seasoned homicide team or crime scene specialists to lead interviews, not officers who usually dealt with racketeering cases. In his interview, Marty suddenly recalled seeing an unknown man in the backdoor bar, a man he claimed stood out like a sore thumb. His description was precise. A white male, early 20s, about 5'7" or 5'8", with long hair tied into a ponytail, a dark moustache, and a buck knife strapped to his belt. When pressed, Marty described yet another man he noticed that night, this one taller, in his late 20s to early 30s, with short curly hair, standing around 6'1" or 6'2". He said the man had entered the bar around 1 a.m, purchasing a case of beer before leaving into the night. Ironically, he had almost described himself and his friend Bo. Two mysterious strangers, a night of shifting stories, and a man at the centre of it all who seemed far too eager to paint pictures of others. In that same interview, just a day after the murders occurred, Marty told police he'd heard that the victims had been attacked with a hammer. And then came a curious claim. He told police that a claw hammer had suddenly gone missing from his home. It had gone missing shortly before the murders, and he'd been unable to find it in the days and weeks prior. But there was a problem. Police had never released to the public that a hammer was used, nor had the hammer used to kill Dana been missing from the crime scene. The revelation immediately placed Marty high on the suspect list. Plumas County Sheriff Sylvester Thomas would later say Marty had been providing endless clues in what he firmly believed was an attempt to throw the suspicion away from him. Marty then went on to tell investigators that his stepson, Justin Eason, might have witnessed something the night of the murders, and even after admitting that he himself was experiencing outbursts of extreme anger due to the stress of his marriage breakdown with Marilyn, he was allowed to just leave. When Marilyn was interviewed, she gave a very candid and troubling account of the night of the 11th of April. That night, while Marilyn fell asleep, Marty and Bo returned to the bar for more drinks. When they showed up later, they were dressed in three-piece suits and sunglasses. An unusual sight in a small-town dive bar, especially so late at night. Patrons remembered them clearly, which some would later suggest might have been an intentional attempt to create a memorable alibi. According to Marty and Bo, they stayed out until the bar closed at around 1:30 a.m, then headed home to sleep. But Marilyn claimed that she woke up around 2 a.m. and saw the two men burning something unidentifiable in their wood stove. She never found out what it was, and Marty later dismissed it as just another log. In the days following the discovery of the bodies in cabin 28, Marilyn told investigators she believed that her estranged husband was involved. Her suspicions were based not only on his strange behaviour that night, but also on his deep dislike of teenager John Sharp and his tendency toward aggression and violence when drinking. Marilyn also revealed that Bo had developed a crush on Sue and allegedly made advances toward her on the night of the murders, advances that Sue firmly rejected. This fueled speculation that Marty and Bo may have killed in a drunken rage, with Sue and John bearing the brunt of their violence. Years later, Marilyn claimed that she had discovered a bloody jacket in her basement which she believed belonged to missing 12-year-old Tina Sharp. She said she turned it over to police, yet no record of it exists in the official case files. Whether the event was fabricated or the evidence was mishandled remains unknown, but for many critics it became yet another example of the investigation's deeply flawed handling. John Bo Boobaday was also questioned about his whereabouts on the 11th. Bo was a convicted felon and was certainly no stranger to trouble. His criminal record stretched across years with convictions for robbery and multiple drug offences, marking a troubled past. But that was only part of the story. Bo was believed to have deep ties to organised crime in Chicago, and whispers linked him to the shadowy underworld of Las Vegas, where he was allegedly an enforcer for mobsters, someone who handled the dirty work behind the scenes. Some believe this was the reason the Department of Justice investigators were brought in to do the interviewing, rather than homicide detectives. That Bo was some kind of informant, and the Department of Justice tried their hardest to cover up the crime to protect their asset. Though both Marty and Bo's stories were filled with conflicting details, they were almost immediately ruled out as suspects. Marty even passed a polygraph test, seemingly clearing him of any involvement. Just 2 days after the murders, Bo left Keddie for good. But questions lingered. Marty Smart was alleged to have had a close friendship with Plumas County Sheriff Sylvester Thomas, a connection that raised many eyebrows. Despite the glaring gaps and conflicting information in his timeline during the critical hours of the Keddie murders and the mystery surrounding the missing claw hammer, Marty was never pressed any further. Attention soon turned to the three young boys who had been in cabin 28 that fateful night. Rick and Greg Sharp remembered nothing out of the ordinary. They were asleep in their shared room, unaware of the horrors unfolding just feet away. But Justin Eason's story was different, conflicted and confusing. At first, he told investigators that he had dreamed the disturbing details of the murders. Later, he changed his account, insisting he had actually witnessed the brutal events firsthand. His shift in testimony added another layer of mystery and raised questions about what really happened in those dark hours. In a determined effort to uncover the truth, Justin was placed under hypnosis by Dr. Jerry Dash, a psychologist at Children's Hospital Los Angeles. During the first session, on May the 19th, 1981, Justin described a vivid scene, a vision of a dream he had had the night of the murders, where he found himself on a boat, watching John and Dana locked in a fierce struggle with an unknown man. This stranger had long black hair, a dark moustache, and wore dark glasses, making him impossible to identify clearly. Justin described this dream in vivid detail. He said, "I am on my passenger boat. Somebody got thrown out and there was a fight. He had long black hair, short over the ear. His hair was combed back. He had black glasses with gold ring and a gold frame and black and brown lenses. He had a moustache, jean jacket, blue jeans, no belt, cowboy boots, black round toe with a squiggly design. He had a hammer in his left hand and it had a wooden handle and a steel hammering thing and a point at the end. Johnny and Dana fought the man. Dana was almost drunk. He was walking weird. A crowd gathered. Johnny was thrown overboard, and Dana. The man ran away. A body was lying on the bow. The mom, Sue. She had black hair and a sheet over her. I looked under the sheet and she was slit on the chest. Everybody started to gather around her and we started to go to shore. The man had a knife like a pocket knife in his right hand and he cut Sue. He didn't cut her first. No, before he went off the boat, he cut her. There was another man dressed up like him. He was in the crowd, but when the man dove into the water, they killed Sue. Nobody had a gun. Then I woke up. The man just said her name, Sue. He had brown hair past his ears, halfway, curly at the end. The same kind of glasses as the other man and same kind of clothes. He wore marked army boots, green like a hiking boot with a waffle stomper type sole. The man used a knife on Johnny. I was down by Sue, trying to take care of her. All the blood was coming down and I was trying to patch her up with a blue and white flowered rag. I threw the rag in the water. The men both took the life raft, but the brown-haired man covered Sue first. Johnny and Dana touched the wall by the TV while they were fighting. It's entirely possible that this strange vision was influenced by something the family had been watching that very evening, because Justin, Rick and Sue Sharp had been watching an episode of The Love Boat before heading to bed at around 10 p.m, a detail that actually adds quite an eerie layer to Justin's hypnotic recollections. In a second hypnosis session, Justin changed his account again, this time admitting that he had actually witnessed the murders. Justin revealed that he had heard a noise which had woke him up. He'd gone to the bedroom doorway and peeked out into the living room. Sue was lying on the sofa and the two men he had described previously were standing in the centre of the room. John and Dana then came home and entered the front door. John argued with the two men and a fight broke out. Dana tried to get away and fled towards the kitchen when the brown-haired man struck him with the hammer. Sue rushed to John's aid and Justin returned to his room and hid behind the door. The suspects then tied up Johnny and Dana. Justin said Tina came out of her room, dragging a blanket, and asked what's going on. The two men then rushed to Tina and grabbed her by the arms before dragging her out the back door as she cried for help. Later, the brown-haired suspect returned and covered up Sue with Tina's blanket, which had been left behind. Justin told his mother that someone had a sweatsuit on. Johnny's hands were tied and there was blood all over his face. He talked about the TV. Justin said that Johnny and Dana came in at midnight. Justin stated that Sue was cut in the middle of her chest by a black-haired man using a pocket knife. Justin apparently then got back into bed, covered himself with a blanket, and fell asleep in about an hour. Some details from Justin's hypnosis session lined up with what investigators already knew. The boys had been tied together, medical tape wrapped tightly around their ankles to stop any chance of escape. Sue Sharp had been stabbed in the chest, a knife the weapon of choice, and the outer door handle of the boys' bedroom had smeared blood on it, indicating that somebody had potentially entered the room, either during or after the murders. Justin's claim that Tina was taken through the back door also made sense, especially since it had been found unlocked when James Seabolt arrived, searching for the boys. Working with a sketch artist, Justin helped create composite images of the two men he described. The first was tall, between 5'11" and 6'2", with short, dark blonde hair. The second was shorter, around 5'6" to 5'10", with long, greasy black hair. Both were believed to be in their late 20s to early 30s, each wearing gold-rimmed sunglasses. But there was another problem. The man who produced the sketches was a man by the name of Harlan Embry, a man with no artistic ability and no training in forensic sketching. It was never explained why. With access to the Justice Department's and FBI's top forensic artists, law enforcement chose to use an amateur who sometimes volunteered to help local police. These sketches were publicised in the weeks and months after the murders, and many people came forward claiming to have either seen the men in the area or claiming to know who they were. But it appears none of them ever came forward with a valid suspect. Many in the small town of Keddie would discuss in hushed tones, though, that one of the men in the sketch bore a striking resemblance to Justin's stepfather, Marty Smart. Police worked to piece together the sequence of events that led to the deaths of Sue Sharp and her son John, his friend Dana, and the disappearance of young Tina Sharp. Based on Justin's account, it was believed that Sue was home with the boys when two unidentified men entered the cabin. Whether invited or having forced their way in without damaging the front door, their arrival set a deadly chain in motion. John and Dana arrived shortly after and confronted the intruders, sparking a violent argument that quickly escalated into a fight. The boys likely tried to escape, prompting the men to bind their legs together to prevent any chance of fleeing. Sue, too, was tied up and gagged, likely to stop her from calling for help. All three victims were then viciously attacked, bludgeoned, stabbed, and in Dana's case, strangled to death. It was during this horrific moment that Tina emerged from her bedroom, witnessing the brutal murders of her mother and brother. One of the men grabbed her and carried her out through the back door, while the other picked up her yellow blanket and draped it over Sue's body. Investigators believed at least one additional weapon was brought to the scene, possibly another hammer, which, along with the pellet gun used to bludgeon Sue, was taken away afterward. The killers had worn gloves, leaving behind no physical evidence to reveal their identity. Rumours began to swirl through Plumas County, whispering that the Keddie murders were tied to drugs, or worse, that a ritualistic killer or satanic cult was behind this carnage. No drugs were found in cabin 28. Claims from a Carla McMullen, a family acquaintance of Dana Wingate, about his involvement in LSD theft from local drug dealers remained unproven and unsubstantiated. Despite these distractions, police devoted thousands of man-hours to the case. Detectives even ruled out notorious serial killers Henry Lee Lucas and Otis Toole by December 1983. In the early 1980s, these two names dominated headlines for their brutal crimes. Both men were convicted of multiple murders, but their real infamy came from the sheer number of killings that they claimed responsibility for. At one point, they confessed to dozens of murders across the United States, especially Henry Lee Lucas, prompting speculation that they might be among the most prolific serial killers in history. Because of their willingness to talk, and their known presence in Northern California in 1980, just months before the Keddie murders, investigators in Plumas County examined them closely as potential suspects. But their alibis told a different story. Records showed that just 2 days after the Keddie murders, both men were in Jacksonville, Florida, indicted for another killing. It was simply impossible for them to have been in Keddie and Florida in such a short time. Further investigation revealed that they hadn't returned to California until May 1981, a full month after the murders. They were ruled out. Another figure who caught investigators' attention was Robert Joseph Silveria Jr., later nicknamed the Boxcar Killer, a drifter who travelled the country by hopping freight trains. Silveria targeted victims in and around homeless camps and railway lines, often killing for robbery. When he was arrested in 1996, Silveria began confessing to a string of murders, Investigators learned that he had lived in the area at the time of the Keddie murders, based in Quincy, just a few miles away, and he had frequent contact with the Plumas County Sheriff's Office between 1979 and 1986. He even confessed to the Keddie killings. But that confession collapsed when it emerged that he'd been in state custody at the time, serving a sentence for grand theft auto. Again, the trail went cold. Because Tina Sharp was missing, presumed killed, the FBI initially took charge of the investigation, but by late April 1981, they withdrew, satisfied that the Department of Justice was handling the case and really didn't require their involvement. But no leads surfaced about Tina's whereabouts. No one knew if she was alive or dead. That grim question was answered over 3 years later. On April 22nd, 1984, a bottle collector named Ronald Pedrini discovered a skull fragment out in the woods near Camp 18 in Feather Falls, over 100 miles from Keddie in neighbouring Butte County. He'd been out there collecting bottles and cans to recycle when he stepped on something that he thought maybe resembled a human bone. At first, the discovery of the skull fragment wasn't linked to Tina Sharp or the Keddie murders at all. Investigators thought it might have belonged to an Indigenous person from many decades earlier, and without the strange twist that followed, they might still believe that to this day. Soon after the find, the Butte County Sheriff's Office received an unusual phone call. The caller, who never gave a name, hinted that the skull could belong to the young girl who had gone missing from Keddie a few years earlier. This call wasn't mentioned in the original case records, but in 2013, a recording surfaced, and it was enough to spark a fresh look at the discovery. A few weeks later, search teams returned to the same remote area, and scattered nearby, they found more remains, little more than bone by this stage. Nearby, investigators found clothing, a blue nylon jacket, Levi's jeans missing a back pocket, a blanket, and an empty surgical tape dispenser. The identity wasn't confirmed immediately, but in June 1984, a forensic pathologist matched the skull and jawbone to 12-year-old Tina Sharp through dental records. The state of the remains suggested that she had likely died the same night her family was murdered, or not long after. For reasons unknown, her body had been moved to this isolated location, miles from Keddie, and left to the elements for years. While this awful discovery didn't solve the case, it did answer one painful question for her family: where Tina was. She was finally laid to rest alongside her mother and brother in Quincy. Ronald Pedrini remained an interesting figure in the case because he was seemingly an innocent bystander just going about his business who stumbled on a distressing discovery. But he was collecting bottles and cans in an area that was rarely ever frequented by anyone, and he also just so happened to find Tina's remains within days of the 3-year anniversary. To many, his involvement seems more than a bit strange. And then there's a mysterious caller. He learned that a skull fragment had been found out by Camp 18 and seemed confident that the remains could be Tina's. Almost no details about the skull were released to the public. If you think of the many missing men, women and children in Northern California, it really was an incredible coincidence that this particular portion of skull actually was Tina's. Who was this caller? I don't think we'll ever know, because investigators either didn't follow up on the lead or completely failed to make any real notes about it. But either way you look at it, it does nothing but lead to more speculation about the complete ineptitude of the investigation or utter corruption that was taking place. Police held on to the original recording of that anonymous call and supposedly made copies to distribute, but mysteriously, all copies vanished from the records. Months after the murders, Marilyn Smart was questioned again by Department of Justice investigators Harry Bradley and P.A. Krim, and this time she revealed new, slightly troubling information. She said that she left her husband Marty the day after the killings, fleeing his abusive and violent behaviour. 2 weeks later, Marty drove to Reno, and on April 27th, 1981, just 16 days after the murders, he sent Marilyn a really unnerving letter. It states, "I've paid the price of your love, and now that I've bought it with 4 people's lives, you tell me we are through? Great. What else do you want?" Marilyn was utterly convinced Marty was involved in these murders. She told investigators that Marty harboured a deep, deep hatred for John Sharp, and he despised Sue for interfering in their relationship. Rumours had swirled before and after the murders that Marty and Sue had been involved in an affair, which ended when Marilyn found out. And it's been reported that Sue was trying to get Marilyn to leave her relationship with Marty because he was being abusive towards her, and Marty could not stand the meddling. Many consider the Keddie investigation botched from the very start, and although I don't often give a lot of opinions, I do have to say that I agree 100% in this case. From the very beginning, the handling of the crime scene was riddled with errors. Instead of securing the area immediately, Plumas County Sheriff allowed a parade of people, neighbours, visitors, and even potential suspects to walk freely through the scene before any evidence was preserved. This utter lack of control created a chaotic environment that compromised crucial forensic clues, making it almost impossible to reconstruct the events of that night with certainty. Compounding the problem was the poor coordination among law enforcement agencies. Although the crime was violent and seemingly premeditated, the FBI initially declined involvement, citing jurisdictional boundaries. Yet with 12-year-old Tina Sharp missing and presumably kidnapped, this should have prompted federal intervention. The absence of urgency during the critical first 48 hours led to missed opportunities, with leads growing cold before they could even be properly pursued. The forensic investigation fared no better. Vital evidence, blood samples, fibres, and potential DNA was lost, misplaced, or never analysed. A bloody fingerprint discovered at the scene was never fully examined, and the weapons used in the attack were not comprehensively reviewed. A second bloody knife, found discarded in a trash bin at the Keddie General Store, was never fully examined. Shockingly, some of the collected evidence languished unprocessed for decades, rendering it nearly useless. Equally troubling was the failure to thoroughly analyse forensic materials linked to key suspects. The bloody jacket, reportedly handed to police by Marty Smart's wife, was never documented or tested. Marty also allegedly confessed to the murders during therapy sessions, but the police failed to act on these admissions when Marty's counsellor reported them. Marty had supposedly told his counsellor that he'd killed Sue and taken and killed Tina because she was a witness, but vehemently denied killing the boys. These critical oversights turned what could have been breakthroughs into dead ends, severely hampering the investigation. The discovery of Tina Sharp's skeletal remains nearly 3 years later only deepened the mystery. Found in a remote location alongside a medical tape dispenser, forensic examination was never conducted or never made public. The prolonged delay and exposure to the elements likely destroyed invaluable evidence, further clouding the circumstances surrounding her disappearance and death. The Keddie tragedy quickly morphed into a sensationalised media spectacle. Rather than focus on factual reporting, newspapers and television outlets prioritised lurid headlines and wild speculation. Stories ranged from serial killer involvement to satanic cult theories, none supported by evidence, but powerful enough to divert public and investigative attention. Eventually, the case went cold. The prime suspects, Marty Smart and John Bo Boubidet, both died by the turn of the millennium. But the mystery never faded. The case continues to pop up on message boards and true crime websites, spawning countless theories about who was responsible and why. Some believe that Marty and Bo are the only suspects and that they had no assistance. Instead, they acted together to exact revenge on Sue. Some claim that Marty had been angered with Sue because she'd grown so close to Marilyn. It's been reported that Sue was urging Marilyn to leave Marty because he was abusive towards her. Sue, feeling empowered by leaving her own husband for the same reasons, thought that Marilyn should follow suit. It's been claimed when Marty found out, he killed Sue so Marilyn would stay with him. The other victims were, according to this theory, collateral damage. They saw him and Bo carrying out the attacks and had to be disposed of. The boys were left alive in the bedroom because Marty knew his stepson Justin was there. But that doesn't really explain Tina. Why not kill Tina and leave her at the scene like everyone else? One possibility is that Tina had either already been awake or woken up and heard some kind of unusual noise. She could have quickly gotten dressed if she'd been in bed, or just grabbed a coat and shoes as she realised something horrendous was happening and fled out the back of the cabin. Marty or Bo may have caught up with her outside and killed her elsewhere. However, Tina was always at the Seabolts' residence. If this had been the case and she'd fled her home in a panic, why did she not run next door to the Seabolts or another neighbour's cabin, shouting and making as much noise as possible to alert everyone to the tragedy unfolding? This was a brutal massacre, yet nobody seemed to have made any noise. Some suggest that Marty and Sue were having an affair and Marilyn found out. There's claims that Marilyn and Bo committed the murders and then framed Marty as punishment for his infidelities. Again, the boys in the bedroom were spared because Marilyn's son was there. But again, this doesn't explain why Tina was removed from the scene. Others claim that Tina was the target. It's been reported on some crime forums that Marty had been potentially molesting Tina and she was pregnant with his child. He was going to kidnap her to make sure nobody ever found out. Marilyn Smart definitely let investigators know she was suspicious of her husband and that they should be too. The letter he sent to her confessing that he had bought her love with 4 people's lives was proof beyond a reasonable doubt, right? Except that isn't what the confession in the letter really said. That particular part is really only a small snippet of what he said, cherry-picked to fit the narrative that Marty is definitely the killer. The full letter actually reads, "Dear Marilyn, first off, you know that I haven't tried to hurt you with my letters. I'm writing this after our phone call, Monday, the 27th of April. Marilyn, there's 2 things I want you to know. The first is that I love you and I don't care what has happened. Now is the time to start over. Call now. You don't know how much I suffered before I met you. I asked God to send me someone who would care for me. I thought he sent you. I remember the hour, the words that were said. I said your phone number 1,000 times that night. I've given you my heart, all of it. Please try and think back. What do you think I've paid for you? For 3 years, I've heard about your kids. Don't get me wrong, I love them too. Now I'll ask, what about mine? Don't you think I love them? Honey, I gave up 4 of the most precious things in my life. For what? For you. The answer is simple. Now I'll ask you, why should I love your kids more than mine? I've tried. That's more than you can say. I don't think you ever loved me, much less my kids, and yet you expect this from me, and I've given it to you. I've paid the price of your love, and now that I've bought it with 4 people's lives, you tell me we're through. Great. What else do you want? I've paid the price. I've given my flesh and blood for you. I'll gladly pay your bills. Just send them in. You know that I love you more than my own kids. Can you say that? I know you have given up a lot to be with me, but I don't think you know what I've paid. Yes, I'm jealous. For the price I've paid, I should be. You can't seem to understand how bad you have hurt me. I'm crawling back. Take me. I've paid for your love. Please give it back at least once. If you don't, you know you've stolen my heart and given it to the street. I love you. Think about what I've given up for you. Call me. Please don't wait until it's too late. I've given it all. What else do you want? And as a separate document, Marty writes, "Oh God, I love you more than life. Please forgive me, Marilyn. I'm sorry." Now, the full letter seems to make it very clear that Marty isn't talking about taking the lives of the 4 people in cabin 28, but rather he's given up on his own 4 children to be with Marilyn. It reads as though Marilyn didn't particularly like his children, and to ensure that he could keep his relationship with her, he stopped seeing his own kids or bothering with them as much. It's apparent from the letter that this had hurt him, and he wanted Marilyn to know that. I can't see anything suspicious at all in that letter that suggests he is confessing to killing Sue, John, Dana, and Tina. That's not to say he didn't commit the crime, but this letter certainly doesn't support a confession, as we're so often led to believe, by only being shown one line of it. So if Marty wasn't responsible for the brutal murders, and Bo wasn't responsible, who else could have been? Was it possible that Sue's new love interest, Daryl Josephson, was involved? She had been dating him for a couple of weeks before the murders, and had reportedly spent time at his cabin, her cabin, and the bar. They seemed to have spent quite a bit of time together in that week, but Daryl had a solid alibi. He had travelled to Paradise and spent the night at his ex-wife's home, returning to Keddie on the 12th. Did Sue have any other relationships, failed or otherwise, that we don't know about? Sources suggest that since moving into Keddie, she'd actually been in 3 separate, shortish relationships. Around the end of February 1981, at approximately 10 p.m, a neighbour of the Sharps, Frank Davis, in cabin 13, stated that there was a hell of a fight between Sue and a man on a Friday night. Davis described the man as about 35 years of age, about 4 inches taller than Sue, stocky build, and dark curly hair like an afro. Her ex-husband, James, was ruled out due to his alibi. He'd been away with the Navy. It seems to most people that the target of the brutal attack was either Sue or Tina. Sue had been bound the most intricately and gagged. She'd been left naked from the waist down, which suggests a sexual element to the assault. However, it was noted at autopsy that there were no signs of a sexual attack taking place. Was this perhaps the motive, but the perpetrators were disturbed by John and Dana returning home? Did things just spiral out of control from there? Among the many grim possibilities surrounding the Keddie murders, one of the most disturbing theories is that young Tina Sharp was taken not just as a witness, but for far darker reasons: sexual abuse or human trafficking. Tina was only 12 years old when she vanished from cabin 28. In a community already shaken by brutal violence, the thought that she might have been targeted for exploitation sends a shiver through anyone who hears it. Some investigators and true crime researchers have speculated that Tina's disappearance was no accident, that she was abducted deliberately, perhaps sold or forced into a horrific cycle of abuse. This theory stems from several really unsettling facts. The killers showed signs of planning, bringing tools and weapons prepared to control the victims. Tina was taken from the scene alive, carried quietly through the back door while the carnage unfolded. She was afforded time to get her coat and shoes in the midst of a triple murder. The presence of medical tape used to bind the victim suggests a calculated effort to restrain and control, not just kill. Moreover, the mystery surrounding her fate, missing for years before her remains were found far from Keddie, raises questions about whether she was held captive, moved from place to place, or subjected to abuse before her death. While the official investigation focused largely on solving the murders, less was done to explore the possibility of sexual abuse. The fear and stigma surrounding such crimes in the early 1980s may have contributed to this silence, allowing critical leads to go cold. Sex trafficking rings were notoriously difficult to detect, often operating under the radar in rural areas like Plumas County. It is possible that Tina's abduction was connected to a larger hidden network. Terrifying reality that law enforcement was really ill-equipped to uncover at the time. Despite decades passing, this theory remains a harrowing question mark. Did Tina become a victim not only of a violent crime, but of a more sinister, ongoing evil? Did she suffer in ways that the community never fully understood? And then there are the theories that accuse the victims themselves. Some corners of the internet suggest that Tina hated her mother because she felt that Sue allowed her to be molested due to Sue's neglect of the children. They also claim that Sheila hated her mother too because she'd made her give up her baby for adoption in Oregon. Many people theorise that Sheila and Tina enlisted the help of the Smarts, specifically Marty, to get rid of the problem in their lives. That problem being their mother. This theory tends to allege that Justin was sent to sleep at cabin 28 that night so he could assist. He was aware of what would be happening and he needed to help Tina escape while the murders were being committed. Sheila was simply acting as a decoy by spending the night at the Seabolts and was there so they could provide her with an alibi before she went off to pretend to find the murder scene. And what if neither Sue nor Tina were actually the targets? There's a possibility that this was a random, violent attack on an unknown family, a potential robbery gone bad or carried out by someone heavily under the influence of drink or substances, maybe even someone just seeking a thrill kill. Then there's the rumours about John, Dana and Marty Smart. In June 1980, a man named David told investigators that John and a boy named Tim entered his house, stole a lid of marijuana, and then did the same thing again in December 1980. Don Davis, Sue Sharp's brother, stated John smoked drugs, drank, and fought a lot at school. To his knowledge, though, John wasn't into heavy drug usage, and he didn't have any unusually large amounts of money. Another person interviewed stated that Dana bragged that his father provided him with all the dope that he and his friends could ever need. Carla McMullen, another associate of John and Dana, told investigators that it was rumoured that they had stolen 10 sheets of acid from someone. Steve Durham, an associate of Marty Smart, stated that he smoked hash from Marty on 2 occasions. He stated Marty would also front hash to people he trusted, and Marty made hash. Steve said he'd seen as much as 1 pound of it in Marty's house. Jerry Roll, Dana's high school counsellor, stated that Dana associated with low-life dopers and said he was not passive, not an easygoing person, and would react when confronted. John and Dana had been attending a party in Quincy the night of the murders, and it's alleged that this party was an acid party, although there are conflicting reports from other partygoers as to whether they had actually been seen there or not. Some of this may be due to the fact that the party was actually at the home of a prominent family in the area, and people were too scared to come forward for fear of getting into trouble themselves. Other sightings of the boys and various people who claim to have picked them up and dropped them off around locations in Quincy suggest that the boys were carrying out some kind of drug deals. Did someone follow them home to Keddie? Someone they had wronged? Or someone they owed a debt to? Someone who maybe thought that they could take the opportunity to raid a drugs or money stash at John's home? A random person from the party at Quincy who just thought they could turn up at cabin 28 and continue the fun until an argument broke out and things got devastatingly out of control? Or was someone after Marty? Had Marty stung someone in a drug deal? Had Bo? He also had previous drugs convictions. Did the perpetrators get the wrong house? Robbery was ruled out as nothing other than 12-year-old Tina, her coat and shoes, and a toolbox were missing. An opportunistic killer doesn't really fit the bill either. The perpetrators who entered cabin 28 were well equipped and clearly had some kind of plan. So who killed the Sharps? And why is nobody talking? In 2013, the Plumas County Sheriff's Office reopened the investigation. Sheriff Greg Hagwood, in his 3rd year on the job, faced a lot of challenges with this case because he was short on staff and his budgets were ridiculously tight. Hagwood had known John and Dana personally. He'd even spent a night in cabin 28 years before the Sharps moved in. A graduate of California State University in Sacramento with a degree in criminal justice, Hagwood was determined to find answers where others had come up short. By 1988, Greg Hagwood had started his career as a deputy in his hometown. During those early years, he watched the investigation into the Keddie murders unfold and stall. The case remained open, but it was no longer a priority. It had become known simply as the Keddie murders, one of the country's most infamous unsolved crimes. Driven by his personal connection to the victims and the case, Hagwood made the decision to resurrect the investigation. He committed the resources and time necessary to finally bring some answers. To lead the effort, he invited Mike Gamberg, a private investigator, to take over as a Plumas County Special Investigator. Gamberg had once been a deputy with the Plumas County Sheriff's Office before the murders, but he'd actually been fired. Though he was reinstated later, Sheriff Thomas kept Gamberg sidelined, seemingly excluding him from the investigation and ignoring many of his leads. Familiar with the community, experienced in homicide investigations and knowing some of the victims personally, Gamberg believed that his insights should actually have been taken seriously from the very start. He'd also known the boys, and he was actually their coach in martial arts. The day before the murders, Dana Wingate had actually been over at his house. Gamberg had his own suspicions about what had happened in that cabin, so he accepted the job and began following the evidence and the leads that still existed. He started by going through the boxes of evidence at the Keddie murders crime scene room, which was filled with drawers full of information and other evidence that was just all messed up and in disarray. With the original case history log missing, it was nearly impossible to track down who did what and when. Gamberg believes he knows what happened to the records, but they've never been recovered. Much of the physical evidence from Cabin 28 remains in storage to this day. The living room carpet, pieces of wallboard stained with blood splatters and smears, and other potential clues, but the evidence that survived was badly disorganised, poorly stored, and in some cases even contaminated. Gamberg actually revealed that some of the evidence was placed in a freezer for preservation, but the freezer had been turned off. He said in an interview with People about the reopening of the case, "This case is as screwed up as a soup sandwich. It's not about what was done, but what was not done." He found a sealed bag of evidence that had never been opened or properly entered into the official chain of custody, a fundamental step in any criminal investigation. On March the 24th, 2016, a hammer was found in a pond near the Keddie resort. The tool matched the description of the hammer that Marty Smart claimed was stolen from him. A local man came across it when the pond had dried up a bit and he was out there with a metal detector, and he reported it to the police. Sheriff Hagwood said that due to the location it was found, the hammer had to have been intentionally put there and wouldn't have been accidentally misplaced. Both main suspects, Marty Smart and John Beau Boubidet, vanished from the area soon after the murders. Beau left just 2 days later, relocating to Chicago, Illinois, where he had his ties to organised crime and was involved in scamming police officers. He was actually awaiting sentencing when he died in 1988 for some of these crimes. Marty Smart moved to Oregon, where he died of cancer in June 2000. That same year, the Plumas County Sheriff's Office released the interviews of Marty Smart and Beau Boubidet to the public for the very first time. The response from local authorities and residents was one of shock. Investigators were accused of bungling the interviews, failing to fact-check and corroborate many of the claims Marty and Beau made, which later unravelled as falsehoods. For example, Beau told investigators he'd served 18 years as a police officer in Chicago, retiring only after being shot in the line of duty, a claim that was easily disproved by checking his date of birth. He would have been 9 years old at the time. He also falsely claimed that Marilyn was his niece, and he exaggerated the length of his stay in Keddie by 2 weeks. Beau had said in his statement that Marilyn was asleep when he and Marty returned from the bar, and that clashed directly with Marilyn's statement. He even denied ever meeting Sue Sharp, despite testimony that the three had stopped by Cabin 28 that evening, asking Sue if she wanted to join them. After Marty's death, Gamberg revealed a disturbing confession he made during a therapy session at the Veterans Administration in Reno. In his 7th appointment in May 1981, Martin allegedly admitted to killing Sue Sharp because she had interfered in his relationship with Marilyn. When asked about Tina, he said she was taken because she could identify him as the killer. Explaining why she didn't run, Marty implied, without elaboration, that he had incapacitated her. He told his counsellor, "I had to kill Tina Sharp because she saw the whole thing. I couldn't have a witness." He admitted, "I killed a woman and a daughter, but I didn't have anything to do with the boys." He didn't say who murdered John and Dana, only that they were collateral damage, caught up in the horror because they were there. The counsellor had supposedly urged Marty to turn himself in, but according to investigators, Marty only responded with a smile. Gamberg revealed that during an earlier session, Marty had become so enraged that the conversation had broken down entirely due to Marty's behaviour and an explosive outburst. The counsellor couldn't recall the name of the woman who had provoked this anger, but Gamberg strongly suspects it was Sue Sharp. Marty had apparently boasted to the counsellor, "I beat the polygraph. Those things are easy to beat. I lied, and they let me go." Despite the counsellor alerting the Department of Justice investigators at the time, no arrest followed. The counsellor had even apparently reached out directly to the lead investigators, Bradley and Krim, who met with him, but dismissed the confession as mere hearsay. Now, Marty may well have made this confession because he did commit some of the murders. Marty may also have made this confession because he was suffering quite badly with his mental health. He had issues with alcohol. He had PTSD as a Vietnam War veteran. People do sometimes make false confessions to people, and it may well be the case that Marty actually felt that admitting to the murders might make Marilyn go back to him. She left him the day after the tragedy that befell the residents at Cabin 28. Maybe Marty thought that making this kind of statement, that he'd done this for Marilyn, might make her reconsider her thoughts about him and might make her see how much he actually loved her. He'd given up his children, and now he's done this. It's possible. There are also the rumours that the connection between Martin Smart and Plymouth County Sheriff Sylvester Thomas potentially went far beyond a casual friendship. Marty allegedly told his counsellor that Sheriff Thomas once lived in Cabin 28 before the Sharps moved in. The short distance between Cabin 28 and Marty's residence at Cabin 26 meant that the two could easily meet frequently, often at the local bar, possibly even engaging in questionable dealings together. Marty claimed that during a rough patch in his marriage to Marilyn, Sheriff Thomas had actually allowed him to stay at Cabin 28 with him for some time. Some reports say that when asked about Marty, Sheriff Thomas described them as great pals, saying Marty often spent long hours with him on patrol. Thomas even admitted Marty once sought marriage advice from him, though he confessed he wasn't exactly the best person to give it, having recently gone through a divorce himself. Sheriff Thomas is accused of a cover-up in many online theories. Thomas did say that he gave one session of advice to the Smart couple, which took place before the murders. However, Marilyn Smart doesn't recall the meeting with her husband, Marty, and the sheriff. She said that the two were not friends to her knowledge, though some consider Marilyn a conspirator as well. Sheriff Sylvester Thomas directly addressed the accusations about his friendship with Marty. He stated, "There was no shortage of suspects, but suddenly, everybody 35 years or so later have all figured out what happened and that all of the investigating officers were corrupt. It's laughable, is what it is. Martin Smart was not a friend of mine. At one point, he and his wife were having marital problems, and they came to my office when I was sheriff and wanted me to counsel them." To Gamberg, these tangled relationships only added fuel to suspicions of a cover-up surrounding the Keddie murders. Others have speculated about possible involvement by corrupt Department of Justice special agents, potentially linked to the covert drug smuggling operations backed by the CIA in the early 1980s. One piece of critical evidence Gamberg uncovered years later had been left untouched, an unopened envelope containing the tape recording of that anonymous call made to the Butte County Dispatch Center. The call came shortly after someone discovered the skull and bones of Tina Sharp, found roughly 80 miles downstream in Feather River Canyon. It's a place called Camp 18 near Feather Falls. In 2016, Gamberg shared that tape with People magazine during coverage of the case and a CBS News documentary. The caller's voice was calm, but pointed. He said, "I was watching the news about the discovery down at Feather Falls, and I wondered if they had thought about the murder up in Keddie, Plumas County, a couple years ago, where a 12-year-old girl was never found." Gamberg has his own thoughts and opinions about the mysterious caller's identity. Although both Marty and Bo vanished from Plumas County shortly after their Department of Justice interviews, it's been revealed that Marty was living in Paradise around the time the call was made. Another person of interest is known to have lived in nearby Butte County, according to Gamberg. To get closer to the truth, he enlisted experts to analyse the tape, comparing the caller's voice to recordings of other suspects, both known and suspected. Despite this promising lead, the painstaking scientific process moves slowly. Decades have passed since this crime, and the case no longer demands the urgency of fresher investigations. Gamberg himself suspects that the tape was deliberately set aside when it first reached the Plumas County Sheriff's Office, left to gather dust rather than spark action. Sheriff Hagwood, when interviewed by People magazine, admitted, "I'm not naturally inclined to believe in conspiracies, but there are facts and circumstances, so many and so significant, that I simply can't ignore any more." Just 3 years after reopening the case, Mike Gamberg went public with startling news. New evidence had surfaced. Among the items recovered was the hammer Marty Smart had claimed was stolen from his cabin just before the murders, along with a hunting knife found in Keddie itself. By April 2018, the investigation took another leap forward. DNA extracted from a strip of white medical tape, similar to the tape used to bind the victim's hands and ankles and to cover Sue's mouth, matched a known, living suspect. This tape, found near Sue's body, provided a vital breakthrough. It's been speculated that this DNA belonged to Justin Eason. Neither Sheriff Greg Hagwood nor Gamberg would name names at the time, but the fresh leads narrowed their focus. While the two main suspects, Martin Smart and John Boubidet, are both deceased, Hagwood confirmed others remain alive and have been identified. Now, it's believed as many as 6 people were involved, and Tina Sharp's disappearance was no random act. She was taken for a reason. Hagwood told People magazine in 2016, "There are people locally who know more than they've said. I believe we've identified some of them. We know who they are, and we know where they are. I have every confidence that they either participated after the fact or have first-hand information. There is no expiration date on homicides. With surviving family members, it is our fundamental obligation to understand who did this and why. Every piece of recoverable evidence matters, and Gamberg stated he was going to continue tracking leads and re-interviewing anyone connected to the case. One long-standing mystery: who gave John Sharp and Dana Wingate a ride home between 10 p.m. and 1 a.m. on the night of the murders? Gamberg says he's identified the driver and interviewed her. And then, after this DNA discovery, after identifying who gave the boys a ride home to Keddie and interviewing her, nothing. Just silence, no updates, nothing. Greg Hagwood retired from his position in 2020 and his successor just this very year. Now there's a new sheriff. It's unclear if Mike Gamberg is still at the Plumas County Sheriff's Office or who is handling the Keddie case now. If they have no personal connection to the victims, as Hagwood and Gamberg did, will they have the same drive to try and finally solve this case? It's a seriously troubling thought that this case may remain unsolved. One of the things that makes the Keddie case so difficult to research is the sheer number of conflicting statements and missing documents. Even after all these years, we still don't have a complete picture, and what we do have often raises more questions than it answers. Take the Seabolt family, for example. There's been a lot of confusion between James Seabolt Sr. and his son, James Jr. Some narratives say that it was James Jr. who discovered the murders, ran to Jan Albin's house and got the police called, while James Sr. supposedly helped the boys get out of the bedroom window. But when you're actually looking through the statements, it seems the story is actually the other way around. James Jr. went to the cabin to help the boys escape, while Zanita, his mother, was the one who got Jan Albin to call the police. And James Sr., he's notably absent. At one point, he's chopping wood. Later, he's supposedly off visiting someone, but his whereabouts aren't 100% accounted for. That raises a fair question. If we're still piecing together exactly who did what that morning, and we can't clearly place James Seabolt Sr. at key moments, is that something we should be looking at more closely? After all, in a case this muddled, it's often the details, or the people who slip through the details, that matter. We also know that Zanita has since passed away, but I've been unable to find any death record for her husband, which makes me wonder, is there still more to this story that we're overlooking? Have we been so focused on a few key names that others, who were right there in the middle of events, have been brushed aside? Or is that the wrong rabbit hole to go down? In a case already clouded by confusion, missing files and contradictory witness accounts, it's worth asking, how many of the answers are still hidden in plain sight? As decades passed, the release of crime scene photos and rampant online speculation fueled conspiracy theories and amateur sleuthing. While citizen involvement sometimes aids cold cases, here, misinformation has obscured the truth, making it even more difficult to separate fact from fiction. I found this case quite difficult to research because of that. I've tried to take my details from the official reports that we do have access to. There are a couple of big personalities in terms of other people researching this case, and they're so confident with their theories that it really is very, very difficult to try and separate what might be them cherry-picking information to fit a narrative and what might actually be the truth. The official documents themselves aren't that helpful because they weren't very detailed. Those investigating the case really didn't do a very good job of recording crucially important information. I've looked at theories and I've looked at the original documents, and of course there may still be some things that I've got wrong, even though I've tried to separate the fact from the fiction in terms of who was where, when. If I have got something incorrect during my research, please do drop a comment down below. I'd love to know so I can make an update and correct that, as I certainly don't want to be spreading misinformation. But this case really has been a minefield, and all we can hope is that someday it can be pieced together in a comprehensively factual way. Sue Sharp has been the target of damaging rumours over the years. Some claim she was involved in prostitution, that she was neglectful of her children, or tied up with drugs. But when we look at what's actually in the available records, those claims really don't hold up. For one, there's no evidence that Sue used drugs. In fact, there are statements saying she didn't even drink alcohol. When her home was searched, no drug paraphernalia was found. That alone undercuts a huge portion of the speculation. It is true that after moving to Keddie, she dated a couple of men. But is there anything wrong with that? These were men with jobs, working men. They may not have been the most successful in the fields, we can't know that, but they weren't downtrodden bums either. She wasn't looking for down and outs or bad boys. Dating as a single mother in the late 70s and early 80s looked very different from today. There were no dating apps, no online filters. You just met people where you lived, through neighbours, community events or mutual friends. Sometimes those relationships worked out, and sometimes they didn't. That was life. Sue had also been married for years to John Sharp, and all of her children shared the same father. The rumours painting her as unstable or promiscuous simply don't align with the reality. And this is where we need to stop and look at a much bigger pattern. For well over a century, going back to at least the Jack the Ripper murders in the 1880s, society has viewed the deaths of women involved in sex work, or those rumoured to be, differently. Prostitutes and fallen women, as they've been called, have often been seen as less deserving of sympathy, their murders treated as somehow inevitable or even as a grim kind of punishment for their choices. We see echoes of that same attitude in the way people talk about Sue. Even though there's no evidence she was involved in any sex work, the mere rumour of it has been enough for some to suggest that her murder was somehow to be expected. That's not just cruel, it's dangerous, because it implies that some victims are less deserving of justice than others. Sue Sharp was a mother of 5, a woman trying to raise her children after a divorce, and by every account available, she was doing her best. Suggesting that her death was caused by prostitution or that it was somehow deserved is not only baseless, it's a form of victim blaming that has persisted for generations. And just as with the Ripper's victims, reducing Sue to a label or a rumour doesn't bring us any closer to understanding what happened. It only erases her humanity and risks steering us further away from the truth. Another area where victim blaming has taken root in this case is with the boys, John and Dana. Over the years, rumours have circulated about their behaviour, things like the drug use, petty thefts, dealing and fighting. And yes, by most accounts, they could be a little bit off the rails at times. But let's just put that into perspective. They were teenagers growing up in the late 1970s and early 80s, a time when experimentation, rebellion, and pushing boundaries were incredibly common. What might look reckless to some on paper often wasn't unusual for the era. Sometimes that's just part of growing up. Now, it's absolutely fair to ask questions about possible motives in any unsolved case. If the boys had conflicts or were mixed up with the wrong people, that could be relevant to understand why the crime happened. But here's where the line gets crossed. When people start saying things like, well, they got what was coming to them if they were messing people about with drugs. That's not theory building. That's victim blaming. And it's unacceptable. Because even if those rumours were true, even if John or Dana had been dealing drugs or involved in criminal activity, that doesn't justify their murders. They could have been hardened criminals, even so-called drug lords, and it still wouldn't mean they deserve to die. Murder is not justice. It's not karma. It's not a punishment that anyone had coming. Reducing these boys' lives to mistakes or rumours strips them of their humanity and overshadows a real issue, that they were victims, child victims, of a brutal, unsolved crime. So yes, we can and should look at every potential motive, but let's do it responsibly, without turning speculation into judgment, and without blaming the victims for the violence inflicted upon them. Then there's Tina. Tina's name has been pulled into theories that somehow she caused or triggered the attack simply because she was taken from the scene. In reality, Tina was a 12-year-old child. Whether she was targeted for a reason or taken as a witness, she was a victim. Turning her into anything else is not only disrespectful to her memory, it plays into the dangerous idea that a child can be to blame for the violence committed against them. And Justin Smart was just 12 years old, asleep in the cabin that night. He survived, but his memories of the events have always been unclear. And that can be normal for a child in a trauma situation. Over the years, his testimony has been picked apart, and some have even accused him of knowing more than he told the police. But we do need to remember, he was a scared boy, possibly in shock, possibly threatened. Victim blaming him doesn't get us closer to the truth. It risks silencing valuable voices and re-traumatizing survivors. And finally, we have Sheila, another victim of these rumours and accusations has been Sheila Sharp, the daughter who discovered the crime scene. She was only 14 years old at the time. Imagine at that age walking into your own home and finding your mother, your brother, and his friend brutally murdered. That moment would shape anyone's life forever. And yet, despite the sheer trauma of what she experienced, some corners of the internet have gone so far as to accuse her of being a liar. Some claim she wasn't telling the truth about what she saw, or worse, that she somehow orchestrated or carried out her family's murders. It's difficult to put into words just how devastating those accusations must be for Sheila and for the family that she's built in the years since. It's not just idle gossip. These are character assassinations. They take a grieving teenager, a child at the time, and paint her as a monster. She loved her mother. She loved her brother. And she loved her sister. She has continued to try and defend her mother's memory to this day, something a victim of such a brutal crime should never be having to do. And we sometimes forget that she is a victim too, along with her two brothers and other family members and friends who had their lives ripped apart one night in 1981. And we also need to compare the rumours to the photo evidence that we do have. In all the pictures we see of the Sharp family, although they're limited in number, we see smiling, well-dressed children. They weren't dirty and unkempt or showing any other signs of neglect or abuse at the hands of their mother. They looked like a loving, beautiful family, getting by as best as they could with what they had at the time. We have to step back and recognise the long-term impacts of all this kind of speculation. Sheila hasn't just had to carry the trauma of her family's murders. She's had to live with decades of strangers questioning her innocence, questioning her grief, and slandering her character online. This is why it's so important to stress the line between theory and blame. We can look at the inconsistencies in police reports, the conflicting witness statements, the missing documents. We can ask hard questions about the investigation. But turning that scrutiny onto a child survivor, turning her into a suspect in the court of public opinion, goes far beyond responsible theorising. And beyond the cruelty of it, just think about the real-world effect. This is still an open case. Law enforcement has said it remains under investigation. If Sheila or any member of the Sharp family is constantly being cast as untrustworthy, that could damage their ability to participate meaningfully in the case. It damages public perception. And in the worst case, it could damage the pursuit of justice itself. At the end of the day, Sheila was a 14-year-old when she found her family murdered. That is what we know. Everything else we add to that story, if it's not grounded in fact, runs the risk of re-traumatising a survivor who has already lived through one of the most horrific events imaginable. And this kind of speculation, the kind that doesn't believe what the victims of horrific crimes have said, is so damaging because every minute spent blaming Sheila, Tina, John, Dana, Sue, or Justin is a minute not spent looking at the real suspects. Victim blaming turns tragedy into gossip, and it muddies the waters of an already complicated investigation. It's exactly the kind of distraction the actual killers would have wanted. If we want justice in the Keddie case, we have to start by protecting the victims, not putting them on trial. I just want to pause for a minute before we continue because you'll see crime scene photos in this video, and I've blurred out the worst bits. These images are still difficult to look at, but I've chosen to include them not for shock value or entertainment. They're here because this case involved real people, real lives, and a family who suffered unimaginable loss. And these images are where it should hit home for most. It's easy to get lost in theories or speculation, but these photos should remind us that behind every fact, every statement, and every rumour, there were people who loved and were loved in return. A mother, children, a family whose lives were torn apart in an instant. It's different when you can actually see that. Now, before putting this video together, I reached out to Sheila personally to give her the opportunity to share her thoughts on victim blaming, but she wasn't able to take part at this time. I am so grateful that she kindly responded and for the time that she graciously afforded me. For me, it just felt important not only to let her know that this video was being made, but also to give her the opportunity, if she wanted it, to have her say in her own voice. And should she ever watch this, I hope that she knows that this video was made with her and her family's dignity and memory at heart. Showing these images comes with responsibility, and my hope is that viewers see the human reality here and remember that these were not characters in a story or mysteries that we're just analysing. They're not scenes from movies with fake blood, fake weapons and actors. They were real people, real children with lives that mattered. And whenever possible, I think it's important to centre the voices of those who've lived through it, or at the very least, to extend them that opportunity. I 100% respect Sheila's position in that she's not able to take part at this particular moment in time, but I just wanted you to know that in trying to approach this case as ethically as possible, I did reach out. There's some convincing evidence to suggest that Marty and Bo were the perpetrators, with others potentially helping, either during or after the murders. There's the fact that they both wore very unusual outfits to go back to the bar in, ensuring that they were noticed. Marty appeared to have knowledge of the weapons used in the crime, despite them not being made public, and he went on to conveniently have a missing hammer himself. He was happy to go into great detail, describing individuals he thought may have been persons of interest. He was known to have a temper and be abusive, flying into violent rages when he was drunk. He left the area soon after the murders. He wrote an incriminating letter to Marilyn. He had links to drugs. His friend Bo also had links to drugs and ties to organised crime. Bo left the area just 2 days after the murders. It all seems to fit into a neat little package, except there could be other explanations. Wearing unusual outfits back to the bar doesn't necessarily mean that they were attempting to be noticed to create an alibi. It could actually have been something really childish, especially because they were both drunk. Marty had thrown a wobbler about the music at the bar during his first visit there of the night. It had angered him, so much so that he'd gone home and called the bar from his cabin after leaving to complain again. Nobody really knew who Bo was. Going back to the bar with Bo, dressed as smart mobster types, could just have been a warning shot to the people Marty was so annoyed with. Respect me and my friend because you don't know who we really are. He could have just wanted attention. He might have just wanted people to think that he was something. Marty may well have heard that a hammer was used in the murders through gossip. You have to remember that the cabins were all in close proximity to each other, and it wouldn't be hard for either him or another neighbour to overhear things being discussed by police or family members. We have no record of the first officer, Clement, arriving on scene. We don't know who was where at that point, or who he may have been talking to. Marty may have mentioned his own hammer being missing because he feared someone had genuinely taken it and used it in the commission of the crime, and he didn't want fingers pointing at him. Maybe he was trying to be helpful when he gave a description of the men he saw in the bar that night. In a small community like Keddie, outsiders would be noticed, so it wouldn't be unusual for their appearance to be remembered in detail. Having a temper and flying into rages when drunk doesn't always mean someone is going to resort to murder. Leaving the area soon after really might not be unusual, considering that his wife had left him and he was dealing with the hushed whispers of community gossip, claiming he must be the perpetrator due to a love triangle between him, Marilyn and Sue. Why would he want to stay there? He had lost his job at the backdoor bar, his wife didn't want him, and the community thought he was a murderer. What was left for him in Keddie? A lot of people would probably want to get away. He had links to drugs and a relationship with a felon with ties to organised crime. But that in itself doesn't make someone a murderer. As for Bo, There's no documented evidence out there that Bo has ever been involved in any extremely violent crimes or any other murders. He seems to have just had issues with drugs and a bit of fraud and racketeering. In my opinion, while Marty Smart and Bo Bubadé remain the most widely suspected figures in the Keddie murders, the evidence against them has never been airtight. Much of the suspicion stemmed from circumstantial links, statements, hearsay, and speculation, rather than confirmed, irrefutable proof. It's also worth remembering that some of the theories about Marty and Bo's guilt emerged years later, through layers of retelling, rather than at the time of the investigation. Memory can warp, motives can be misunderstood, and stories can take on a life of their own. If we narrow our focus to only one theory, or two suspects, we risk overlooking other possible explanations entirely. We can't afford to shut down other avenues of investigation just because one narrative feels the most likely or the most satisfying. This isn't about defending Marty or Bo. It's just about acknowledging that justice isn't served by certainty alone. It's served by truth, and truth demands that we keep asking questions, even if they lead us away from the theories that we've come to believe. In true crime, and especially in long unsolved cases like Keddie, it's easy for one theory to become the theory. Once a name takes root in public consciousness, it can overshadow everything else. Every piece of evidence is interpreted through that lens, and every new lead is measured against whether it supports the accepted suspect. The danger in that is obvious. If we're wrong, we're not just misjudging the case, we're actively ignoring other possibilities that could bring us closer to the truth. Tunnel vision doesn't just limit investigators, it shapes how the public sees the victims, the suspects, and the case as a whole. In Keddie, if Marty and Bo weren't the killers, then every year spent focusing exclusively on them was and is a year that the real perpetrators go unchallenged. That's not just a theoretical loss, it's potentially a matter of lives, evidence and justice slipping further out of reach. Now, before we finish, I also want to talk about something else that comes up a lot in true crime, and that is movies inspired by real murders. Now, I do like a good film, whether they be horror films or thrillers, psychological dramas, and I'm totally guilty of consuming these films myself, the ones that are based on real-life events. The Keddie murders, for example, have inspired at least two films, The Strangers and the newer Cabin 28. Both of those take creative liberties, adding things like masks or exaggerated villains, and that's kind of normal for Hollywood. It's storytelling and drama sells, but it's also worth thinking about how this might feel for the families. Seeing something like this turned into entertainment can be really painful, especially when they're still living with the grief and trauma of losing someone that they loved. There's also a practical side to it. Sensationalising real cases can actually make things harder for investigations. When the public focuses on the dramatised version instead of the facts, it can distract from real leads or evidence. So while films like Cabin 28 and The Strangers might be entertaining, personally I wasn't fond of either, it's again important to remember the reality behind the story. Sue, John, Dana and Tina weren't characters. They were real people, and the Keddie community was deeply affected by what happened. So as we look back at this case, it's okay to be curious and to talk about it. We need to talk about it. We need to keep it in the public eye. But we can do that with care, respect and awareness, separating fact from the fiction and remembering the people at the heart of it all. For those of us who research, discuss or report on true crime, the lesson is clear. Stay curious, not certain, and stay kind, not cruel. Certainty might feel comforting, but in cases like this, it can be the very thing that keeps us from finding the truth. The Keddie Cabin murders remain one of the most troubling unsolved mysteries in American history. Over 4 decades later, many questions still linger about who was involved, what truly happened that night, and what fate befell young Tina Sharp. Despite advances in forensic science and renewed investigations, the full truth remains just out of reach. As we close this chapter for now, I want to hear from you. What do you believe happened to Tina? Do you think the killers were known to the community? Or was this a dark secret involving more people than anyone expected? Victim shaming and blaming gets worse as the years go by. Why do you think people stoop to these levels? Share your thoughts and theories down in the comments below. Your insight could be the missing piece in this cold case. Please do share this video far and wide, because someone somewhere knows something that could finally bring justice to the Sharp family. If you have any information, no matter how small, you can contact the Plumas County Sheriff's Office directly. The details are up on the screen. Remember that every tip matters. Together, we need to keep the memory of Sue, John, Dana, and Tina alive and keep pushing for the answers they deserve. Thank you all so much for watching, and a huge thank you to all my subscribers, both long-time supporters and new faces alike. I really do appreciate each and every one of you. I'll be back next week, same time, same place, with another dive into the Watts family tragedy. In the meantime, stay curious, stay kind, and take care of yourselves. I've been Fiona, and this has been Case Continued.